There's a kind of silence. The Cumberland Plateau keeps only in a drought year, when the creeks thin to nothing, and the lakes pull back from their own shores. In the summer of 1890, a lake the people of one Van Buren County cove, called the Stillwater, dropped lower than any living person had seen it. What the receding water uncovered wasn't mud alone. A row of stone arches stood up out of the cracked lakebed, each built by hands no one could name, every one of them facing the same point on the horizon. The cove had a name for that shore, and the name was a warning, and what the drought exposed the shortest day of the year would explain, and the rain would take back. The Cumberland Plateau is a country unto itself, a flat-topped tableland, split by gorges and walled with sandstone bluffs, rising 1,000 feet above the country around it and sitting there like a wall the older mountains threw up and then walked away from. The rock under, it's old, laid down in shallow seas and swampy deltas before anything with a name walked on it, cross-bedded sandstone and seams of coal and the odd conglomerate, and the water has been cutting it for so long that the surface is more edge than flat, a maze of cliffs and rock shelters and gorges dropping away under the trees. In 1890, the people who lived on it lived in the coves, the deep folded pockets where the rock had cracked and the creeks had found a way down, and they lived by what the thin soil would give them and what the timber would sell to the furnaces lower down. Roads were suggestions in that country, and maps were vaguer still, and a man from the county seat was an outsider the moment his horse set foot on a cove trail. The coves kept to themselves the way a body keeps to its own temperature, holding their own weather and their own talk and their own memory of things done on the land before the land was anyone's deed, and they didn't welcome the county's measuring of them. A surveyor was a man who came to turn a cove's lived ground into lines on a page, and the coves had learned to be careful around lines on a page, because lines on a page had a way of becoming taxes and boundaries and questions a family didn't want asked. That summer, the rain quit. It quit the way it quits on the plateau, not all at once, but in a long slow holding back, the springs going quiet first, and then the small creeks running to strings, and then the bigger branches dropping their gravel beds to the air, until by August the land had the look of a thing holding its breath. The cisterns went low, and the corn fired in the fields, the leaves curling gray from the bottom up, the stalks stood in dried mud where water had been, and the air over the gorges had a heat shimmer in it that made the far ridges look like they were breathing. The people of Briar Cove had seen dry years before, but none of them, not the oldest among them, had seen the Stillwater do what it did that summer. The Stillwater was a black lake set in the lowest fold of the cove, fed by no creek anyone could find, and drained by none, so still that the cove said it kept the sky in its face like a mirror it never wiped. No one fished it, and no one swam it, and the children of the cove were raised to keep away from its shore the way they were raised to keep away from a sick animal, with a quiet instruction and no explanation that satisfied. The cove kept their wells and their rain barrels and left the Stillwater alone, the way you leave a room alone when you know someone is resting in it. And the leaving alone had been going on long enough that no one remembered how it started. By the end of August, the lake had pulled back from its shore by 100 paces and more, and the smell of it rose into the cove, like something long held underwater, finally allowed to breathe. Into this came Cornelius Hatch, 44 years old, a county surveyor sent up from the seat to map what land the receding water had freed. He was a quiet man, methodical in the way men who trust a transit and a chain are quiet, and he had been sent because the state wanted the new shoreline recorded before the rains came back and the boundary was underwater again. A long face and the careful hands of a man who writes small and steady went with him, and he had done this work in harder counties without incident, which is to say, without anyone in those counties deciding he had seen something he shouldn't have. He rode in with his gear and oilcloth and a notebook in his coat, and the cove watched him come the way they watched weather, with attention and without warmth. Cornelius made his camp on the high ground above the cove, where the oaks thinned and he could see the whole fold of the valley and the flat black square of the Stillwater at its bottom. He walked down to the lake on the second morning when the light was flat and the heat hadn't yet built, taking the deer trail the cove used in preference to the creek bed, and the trail dropped through a rock shelter where someone had kept a fire a long time ago, the black of old smoke still on the overhang. The exposed lakebed stretched out before him as he came out of the trees, a plain of cracked gray mud baking in the sun, and the smell of it met him before he reached the edge. Dead water and iron and the sharp mineral scent of silt that hadn't seen the air in a man's lifetime. Fish bones littered the mud in long, pale lines where the water had dropped in steps, and a flatboat lay listing a quarter-mile from the new shore, its keel stuck fast in the muck and its paint peeling in the heat. The scale of the exposed ground was the first surprise. A whole piece of the cove that the lake had been hiding, flat and featureless, and wider than the corn ground, the cove had been working for generations, and Cornelius stood at the edge and felt the oddness of standing on ground that wasn't yet ground that was still the lake's, in its own accounting. He set his staff and stepped off the bank and onto the mud, and the mud took his boot with a slow pull and released it with a sound like a cork. A man was sitting on the gunwale of the stranded boat, a ferryman of 50 or more, with a leathery face and a sweat-stained felt hat pulled low over eyes that had been watching the lake a long time. He watched Cornelius pick his way across the mud and said nothing until the surveyor was close enough to hear without raising his voice, because men in that country didn't raise their voices across distances if they could help it. His name was Orrin, and he had run the ferry across the Stillwater for 20 years, carrying the cove's few travelers and their few goods, and he was the one person in the cove who would talk to a stranger, mostly because his work made a stranger of him already. Orrin pointed with his chin toward the far end of the lakebed, where the mud gave way to a low haze of heat, and he told Cornelius that what he was looking for was out there. On the shore, nobody walked. Cornelius asked him what was out there, and Orrin wouldn't say the word for it, only that the water had covered it his whole life, and his father's life before him, and that the cove called that shore by a name he wouldn't speak twice, and that a man who valued his work would do well to map the freed land and leave what stood on it alone. Then he spat into the mud and settled his hat and would say no more, and Cornelius, who had heard cove warnings before and found them to be weather half the time, and old women's talk the other half, shouldered his staff and walked out across the lakebed toward the haze. The mud cracked under his boots with each step, a dry report like something breaking, and the silence on the open lakebed was wrong for midday too full. The kind of silence that has weight to it and presses a little on the ears. He walked for the better part of an hour, the heat shimmer thickening ahead of him until the far ridges swam in it and his water went warm in the canteen and his shirt stuck to his back. It was in that shimmer that the shapes first came up out of the flatness, dark against the glare, too regular, and too evenly spaced to be the work of weather or the rock the plateau throws up along its bluffs. He didn't understand what he was seeing until he was almost on top of it. And then the understanding came all at once and stopped him in the mud with his staff braced against the crack. A stone arch stood up out of the lakebed, a simple thing of 2 uprights and a lintel, dry laid, gray with the same mineral crust that filmed the mud around it. And behind it a second arch stood in a line, and behind that a third. Each one the same rough form, each one set on a fitted base of flat stones the drought had bared. He stood there a long moment with the heat coming up off the mud and the silence pressing in, and then he walked the line, and counted them as he went, and there were 9 of them, evenly spaced, each standing to the height of a tall man, marching out across the lakebed toward the place where the water still lay black and receding. They weren't natural, and the knowing of that was the first thing that settled into him, quiet and certain. The plateau makes arches of its own, sandstone bridges, where the rock has weathered through, and Cornelius had seen those in the gorges lower down, but those are accidents of stone and water, crooked, irregular, no two alike, the rock doing what the rock does when it has time and rain. These were built. The uprights were fitted, the lintels squared, the bases leveled into the lakebed with a care that weather never takes, and the work had the patience in it that takes not a season but generations, the kind of work a people does when the doing of it's the point and not the finishing. He knelt at the base of the nearest one and ran his hand along the stone, and he could feel the tool marks under the mineral crust, the patient dressing of hands that had been in the ground a very long time, longer than the cove, and longer than the county, and longer, he thought, than anything he had been taught to expect from this country. The stone was the local sandstone, the same gray that made the bluffs, but it had been chosen and shaped and set, and the setting had survived under the water, in a line so true that his transit couldn't have improved on it by much. Whatever people had done this, they had done it with a knowledge of the line and the level that the cove didn't carry anymore, and they had done it for a reason the lake had been put over. Then he saw the second thing, the thing that turned the wonder into a question, and the question into a kind of dread. He stood at the first arch and looked through the opening, and the line of sight ran clean down the row and out to a single low point on the southeastern horizon, a notch in the ridge where the sky came down to the trees. He walked to the second arch and looked through it, and the line ran to the same point, and to the third, and to the fourth, and at every arch the opening framed the same gap in the rim of the world. None of the arches faced the cove, and none faced the old trail, and none faced the water, and they weren't aimed at the high peak to the north or the gap to the west. They were all aimed at one place, one low notch on the southeastern horizon, and they had been aimed there on purpose, with the same care a man aims a rifle at the thing he means to hit. He stood in the mud between the seventh and eighth arch, and felt the silence of the lakebed settle onto him like something laid across his shoulders, and the heat shimmer moved over the row, and the mud, and the black water beyond, and the world was very quiet and very old. The cove knew these stones. Orrin knew them, and wouldn't name them, and the shore nobody walked was this shore, and the warning name was for this, and the children raised to keep away from the lake had been raised to keep away from this. The drought hadn't uncovered a curiosity. It had uncovered something the water had been put over, on purpose a long time ago, by people who were gone and by people who came after them and kept the covering as a trust passed down the blood. He walked back to the cove in the late afternoon, with the mud dried to powder on his boots, and the question sitting in him like a stone at the bottom of a well, a thing he could feel the weight of but not see the shape of. The cove had a store and a post office in the same building, a low room with a plank counter and a stove, and the smell of kerosene and ground coffee and the dry sweetness of seed corn stacked in the back. The postmistress was a woman named Miriam Loftus, 40 and some years, who kept the Hollow's memory in the way she kept the mail, sorted and certain, and not given to losing things. He asked her plainly who the stones out in the lakebed belonged to, and he asked it the way a man asks a thing when he already half knows the answer won't be plain. The room went the kind of quiet that has a sound to it, the small sounds of men setting down cups and shifting on their chairs, and a chair leg scraping the floor a half-inch, and then stopping. 2 farmers at the counter paid for their goods and left without finishing their talk, and the men at the stove looked at their boots, and one of them looked at the door, and the quiet organized itself around the question the way water organizes itself around a stone. Miriam didn't look away from him. She told him the water had covered those stones as long as the cove had been the cove, and that the covering wasn't an accident of weather, but something done and kept done, a thing maintained the way a family maintains a grave, with the work going quietly from one generation to the next. She said the cove had a name for that shore, and the name was the kind of word you don't say twice because some words call the thing they name, and the cove had learned to let the water do the calling instead. She wouldn't say it, and she didn't need to, because the not saying was the saying. And Cornelius understood that the warning wasn't a story told to children, but a working arrangement with a piece of ground, the kind of arrangement a cove makes when it has lived next to something long enough to know the terms. The water had kept the terms for them, she told him, and the drought had broken the terms, and that was the whole of what she would say in the open room. It was then that the door opened, and the heat came in, and a man followed it, tall and gaunt, the skin of him leathery and weathered, the way the plateau weathers a man who has lived his life out in it, his clothes stiff canvas crusted with the flour of his mill, and his hat sweat-stained where it met his brow. Thaddeus Crane was 58, and he owned the deed that covered that shore, and had owned it since his father passed it to him, and his father before him, and the deed was the county's word for what the family had been tending in their own word for a great deal longer than the county had been making words. He looked at Cornelius the way a man looks at a gate he's not sure he locked, and he told the surveyor, in a voice the whole room could hear, that he could map the freed land for the county, but he would leave the stones alone. The old men at the stove, freed by the presence of someone who outranked their caution, offered their theories the way the 1,890 offered them, reaching past the people already in the country for someone grand enough to have built in stone. One said it was old Welshmen come inland before the English, another said it was the Spanish of De Soto's wandering. A third said Norsemen who had come up the rivers and built a temple and gone back to the sea. Not one of them said it was the people who had been on the plateau all along, because the country hadn't yet taught itself that the people already here built things of stone, and so the cove reached for lost races and wandering armies the way the whole country reached for them when the ground gave up work it couldn't assign to anyone living. Cornelius went back to the lakebed the next morning with his transit and his chain and his notebook, because measuring was the only language he trusted, and the only answer he knew how to give, a hollow that wanted him to look away. The dawn was cool, and the mud was firmer than it had been, and he set the transit on the high ground above the row, and shot the line, and the line was true, the 9 arches set on a bearing as clean as anything he had laid out for the county in the years he had been doing the work. He chained the span of each arch, and the height of each lintel, and the distance between them, and he wrote the numbers in the book in his small, steady hand, and the numbers confirmed what the eye had already told him, that this wasn't the work of weather or accident, but the work of hands and a ruled line. He shot the azimuth, the bearing that each opening faced, and the bearing was the same for every arch, a single point low on the southeastern horizon, the same notch in the ridge he had looked through the day before. He wrote the number down and circled it, and stood back from the transit, and looked at the row standing in the morning light, and the row looked back at him. 9 openings all aimed at the one gap in the ridge, and the aim was as plain as a finger pointing. Whatever was out there, the whole row had been built to look at it, and only at it, and the looking was the purpose of the building, the way a bell is built around the ringing of it and not the metal. He drove stakes at the end of the row to mark it, oak stakes he had brought for the purpose, and it was while he drove the last stake that he noticed the mud around his boots had gone dark and damp, the first half-inch of water, sweating up through the cracks where it had been dry the day before. The far end of the lakebed, where the water still lay, had crept in by a dozen paces overnight, and the line of the creeping was plain on the mud, a dark band where the dry, cracked ground gave way to the wet. He stood up and looked at the low sky over the ridge and smelled the air, and the air had the iron smell of rain in it, distant but coming. The way a thing is coming when you can smell it before you can see it, the water wasn't gone. It was waiting, the way water waits on the plateau, patient and certain of its own return. He wrapped the notebook in its oilcloth and put it inside his coat, and walked back toward the shore. And the mud sucked at his boots more than it had in the morning, and he understood for the first time that the lakebed was borrowed time. The drought had lent him the arches, the way a man lends a tool he fully means to take back, and the taking back had already begun at the far end of the row, in the darkening mud, and he had a number in his book, and a clean bearing, and no name yet for the thing it pointed to. He looked back at the row once from the high ground, and the arches stood in their line under the climbing sun, and the water at their far end had taken another stake by morning, and he didn't retrieve it. He took the bearing to Miriam that evening, the number written in the book and the direction marked on the page with a small arrow, and she knew what it pointed at before he had finished saying it, the recognition, plain on her face and then quickly put away. She didn't need the number. She read the direction off the page and said, quiet, that it was the place the sun came up on the shortest day, the one morning the old people marked, and the people before them marked before that, and the marking was the oldest thing the cove still carried, older than the families and older than the names. The cove had kept the marking in a dim way, she said, the way a family keeps a prayer. It no longer quite believes, and the people who had built on that shore had kept it in a way that wasn't dim at all. She told him what she knew of the older country, the way a postmistress knows things, in pieces that came from letters and from the talk of men who had dug into the plateau, and found what the soil had kept. There were other stoneworks on the plateau, she said, walls and low enclosures in the neighboring counties, raised on hilltops where two rivers came together, built of undressed stone, stacked and earthed over, the kind of work a people does over generations and not a season. There were mounds raised in lines in the flatter country, west of the ridge, she said, and men had plowed up things in those mounds that no one could explain, and the people who made them were gone before the cove had a name to remember them by, gone the way a people goes when the ground they tended stops keeping them. She didn't claim the cove had built the arches, and she was careful about that, the way a careful woman is careful with the thing she knows is bigger than her knowing. Instead, she claimed that someone had, long before the cove, and that the someone had known the sky the way a farmer knows his fields, closely and by the year and not by the book, and had built the row to the one morning they couldn't afford to miss. She called the row a door, and she said it the way a person says a word. They have been careful of all their life. A door aimed at the shortest day, the longest night, the death of the old year, and the morning the sun came back from wherever the year had put it. The arches weren't a wall and not a temple. She said they were an opening built for one sunrise, and the water had been put over them to keep the opening shut between the sunrises. Cornelius sat with that in the kerosene light of the store, and the men at the stove had gone home, and the room was just the two of them, and the clock on the shelf, and the smell of the coffee going cold. He understood, for the first time, what the arches were for, if not yet who had laid them, and the understanding was a heavy one. They were a calendar, and a door, and a promise made to a morning by people who had been gone so long the cove couldn't remember their names, only their arrangement with the water, and the bearing in his book was the key to the whole of it. But a bearing is only a number until the morning comes that proves it, and the morning that would prove this one was the shortest day of the year, and that morning was still weeks away, and the mud at the far end of the lakebed was already dark with returning water. Thaddeus learned that Cornelius had been told, the way a man in a cove learns everything, by the closing of doors and the quiet that follows a stranger's asking, and the way the store went silent when he walked in. He came down to the lakebed the next morning and found the surveyor at the transit, and he didn't raise his voice because the men of that country had been raised to do their severest talking quietly and to save the loud for the weather and the stock. He told Cornelius the part the cove didn't say in the store, the part that lived in the deed and not in the talk, and he told it standing in the mud with his hat off, which in that country is the way a man tells a thing he means to be taken seriously. His family had kept people off that shore for 2 generations, he said, not out of superstition but out of a trust, a thing passed down from his grandfather to his father to him, that the arches were a door and the water was the closing of it, and that a door left open too long is a door that doesn't shut again. He said it without embarrassment, the way a man says a thing he has lived with long enough to stop being ashamed of, and Cornelius could see that the trust was as real to Thaddeus as the deed in the county office, more real in fact, because the deed was a piece of paper and the trust was a thing the place itself had set his family to. The water covering the stones was in Thaddeus's keeping, not a convenience but a duty, and the drought had been a breach of the duty that the rain was now moving to repair. He wasn't a fool, and he wasn't a villain, and Cornelius could see that as the man stood in the mud with his hat in his hand, and the same weathered patience in him that the stones had in them. He was a man who believed the place itself had given his family a job, the way the plateau gives a family a spring or a hollow, and expects them to tend it and not ask why, and he believed the drought had broken the terms of an old arrangement, that the water was now moving to mend. His fear wasn't of the stones, which had been in the ground longer than his name and would be in it longer than the cove. His fear was of the book in Cornelius's coat, the notebook, that would put the bearing and the count and the morning into the county record, where a thing written down doesn't close the way a thing covered with water closes. Cornelius answered him the way a surveyor answers, plainly, and without sentiment, because sentiment wasn't a language he had, and the plainness was, the drought had already opened the door, he said, and the opening wasn't his doing and not his to undo. Measuring the road didn't change what stood in the lakebed, and leaving it unmeasured didn't put the water back, and the stones were there, and the bearing was there, and the morning that would prove them was coming, whether he wrote it down or not. The only question worth asking was whether anyone would be standing in the lakebed to see the thing work, because the seeing was the proof, and the proof was the whole reason the county had sent him. They stood in the mud between the arches and didn't agree, and the not agreeing was the shape of the rest of it. Two men who were both right from inside their own logic, and who couldn't both be satisfied by the same morning. Thaddeus put his hat back on and walked up to the cove, and Cornelius stayed on the lake bed and shot the bearing one more time to be sure of it, and the number in the book didn't change, and the water at the far end of the road didn't stop, and the sky to the northwest had the look of a sky that has made up its mind. That night Cornelius sat in his camp above the cove, with a lantern and the notebook and the small ephemeris he carried for the work, and he worked the bearing against the sky the way a man works a lock against a key, trying the numbers against the calendar until the tumblers fell. The azimuth the arches faced was the sunrise on the winter solstice, the shortest day, the one morning the whole row had been built to catch, and the knowing of it settled into him with the weight of a thing that has been true a long time and is only now being heard. The arches weren't aimed at a star or a peak or a gap in the ridge for the sake of a gap. They were aimed at the one morning the builders couldn't afford to miss, the morning the sun comes back from the dead of the year and the long night turns. He had read of such things in the papers that came through the county, the old world stone rings and passage graves, built to catch the one sunrise or the one sunset that proved the year had turned, and he had always taken them for the work of older countries with older stones. He hadn't expected to find the same principle standing in a lake bed in Van Buren County, aimed by people whose names the county didn't know, at a morning the county marked only on the church calendar and not in the ground. The bearing was the theory, and the morning was the proof, and the proof was the kind of thing that didn't need a book once it had been seen, because a corridor of light walking down a row of stone at the solstice dawn explains itself to anyone who stands in it. And then the second understanding came, the one that turned the answer into a race and put the dread into the back of his throat. The solstice was only days away, and to prove the alignment he had to stand in the lake bed at dawn on the shortest day and watch the sun come up through the arches in their order, and if it did, the row was a calendar and a door, and the hollow's secret was a secret no longer. Everything he had measured was only a promise, until the sun kept it, and the keeping was a morning. He couldn't move and couldn't hurry. A morning the calendar held at a fixed point while the water rose around it. But the drought was breaking. He had smelled the rain in the air the day before, and the high country to the northwest had been dark all afternoon, with the kind of cloud that doesn't stay on that side of the ridge, and the mud at the far end of the lake bed had already begun to dampen, and two of his stakes were gone. The water was coming back the way it always came back on the plateau, slow and certain, and without any regard for a man's calendar, and the proof and the erasure were running the same course toward the same morning, and only one of them could reach the arches first. He lay in his blankets and listened to the cove and the quiet clock of the water, and understood that the question had changed. It was no longer who built them, because the bearing had told him that as nearly as anyone ever would, a people older than any name the hollow carried. It was whether the water would hold off long enough for a man to stand in the lake bed on the shortest morning and see the thing the row was built to do, and the answer to that wasn't in his book or his transit, but in the sky, and the sky was closing. The rain broke 3 days before the solstice, not as a storm, but as the long, steady soaking the plateau specializes in, the kind that turns the trails to red clay soup and comes down all day and all the next day, and the day after that without ever quite raising its voice. It started in the high country and walked down the ridges into the cove, and the cove received it the way a body receives sleep, gratefully and without resistance, and the corn that had been firing stood up again in the fields, and the cisterns began to fill. The still water began to climb. The same afternoon, the black water creeping back across the lake bed inch by inch, silent and even, the way a tide comes in where there's no sea, to make a noise about it. Cornelius worked the falling water line from first light, waiting out to mark the arches still standing, and to restake the ones the water hadn't yet reached, and the rain ran down the brim of his hat and into the collar of his coat, and didn't stop. The farthest arches went under first, their lintels darkening as the water rose against them, then submerging one by one, until only the black surface showed where they had been, and the row began to shorten from the far end the way a candle burns down. The near arches, the ones that would first catch the sunrise, were still standing, but the water had climbed their bases and stood at the ankles of the stones, and it was still rising, and the rain on the lake had the flat, steady sound of a thing that intends to go on. In the night, the lake rose faster than he had reckoned, the rain doubling sometime after midnight, and he woke to find the water had taken 2 of his stakes and was washing around the third, and he went out in the dark with the lantern and waded out to save the transit and the notebook. He lost the stakes to the current, the oak pulled clean and carried off into the black, and he stood in the cold water to his knees and held the oilcloth book above his head and felt the lakebed give under his boots, the mud going soft where it had been hard, the ground becoming the bottom of the lake again under him. The workspace had become a fight, and the fight was against something that didn't tire, and didn't bargain, and didn't care about the solstice, or the bearing, or the morning he was trying to reach. The cove watched the water come back, with something close to relief, the quiet relief of people who have been holding their breath for a season, and can feel the air coming back into the room. Thaddeus didn't gloat, and didn't come down to the shore, because gloating wasn't a thing the men of that country did, and the shore wasn't his to gloat over. He sent word by way of Orrin, who brought it down to the camp with his hat dripping, that the mountain was keeping its side of the old bargain, and that the surveyor would do well to let it, and that the door was closing the way the door was meant to close, and a wise man didn't stand in a closing door. Cornelius wrapped the book in fresh oilcloth, staked the near arches to the last with what stakes he had left, and resolved to be on the lakebed at dawn on the solstice, whether the water stood in it or not, because the morning was the only proof, and the proof was the only reason he had come up onto the plateau. The night before the solstice came in cold and clear after the rain, the sky opening, the way it opens on the plateau, after a soaking, scrubbed and hard and full of stars, and the air sharp enough to cut. The lakebed lay half drowned under it, with the near arches standing in shin-deep black water and the far ones gone under entirely, the line of them visible only as a fading shadow beneath the surface, and the water had a skin of ice at the edges where it met the mud. Cornelius camped on the shore in his blankets, with the transit beside him and the notebook in his coat, and he didn't sleep, because the morning he had measured toward was hours away, and the water was hours from covering the last of the row, and only one of them could win the race to the dawn. He built a small fire on the shore, no more than a handful of sticks, and he sat by it and watched the stars turn over the ridge, and the black water still on the lakebed, and the 4 arches standing in it like the last of something that had been 9. The cold came up off the water and settled into his coat, and the fire did little against it. He thought about the people who had laid the row, and what kind of winter they had spent setting stones in a lakebed that would go under the water every spring, and he thought about the morning they had built for, and the patience of a people who would build a door for one sunrise a year, and let the water close it for the other 364. Thaddeus came down to the shore in the dark, his lantern swinging low and his breath showing in the cold, and he sat on a rock above the water line and didn't pretend he had come for any reason but the last one. He laid out the fear plainly, the way a man lays out his case, when he knows the hearing is almost over and the judge is already tired. The Hollow's old belief was that the arches were a door, he said, and the door was meant to open once a year to the sun and close again to the water, and the drought had left it open too long, open past its season, open in a way the arrangement had never allowed. His family's job, the trust passed down, was to make sure no one wrote down what the door was for, because a thing written down doesn't close the way a thing covered with water closes, and a door that's understood is a door that stays open in the understanding, even after the water returns. Cornelius heard him out, because the man deserved the hearing, and the night was long enough to give it, and then he gave him the only answer a surveyor knows how to give. Knowledge didn't belong to one family, he said, and a door the sun opened every year wasn't kept open by a notebook. The arches were in the ground before the cove had a name, and the bearing was in the sky before the arches were in the ground, and writing the bearing in a book didn't change what the sun did on the shortest morning any more than not writing it did. The truth wasn't his to keep or Thaddeus's to bury, because the truth was older than both of them and would do what it did whether they agreed or not, and the only part of it that was his was the seeing of it, and the seeing was the one thing he could still do. Thaddeus shook his head slow and gave him the answer that Cornelius couldn't argue away, the one that sat in him after the rest of the talk had gone and the fire had burned down to its coals. Cornelius didn't know what the door was for, Thaddeus said, and that was the whole of it. He knew what it pointed at, and pointing wasn't the same as knowing, the way a sign isn't the same as the place it sends you. The builders had aimed the row at the shortest morning, but what the morning opened, and why the opening had to be shut again with water, was the part the cove had carried and the part the book couldn't hold. A man who wrote down the pointing without the knowing had opened something he couldn't close, and that was the thing Thaddeus's family had been put on that shore to prevent. They sat with that between them, the lantern burning low, the water lapping at the bases of the near arches, and neither of them could rest in the simple rightness of his own case, because both of them were right from inside their own logic, and the logics didn't meet. The cold came up off the water, and the stars turned over the ridge, and the shortest night of the year moved toward its morning, and the notebook in Cornelius's coat was the thing Thaddeus most feared, and it was also the only record that any of it had happened, and it would matter before the sun was up. The dawn came the way the shortest dawn comes on the plateau, hard and clear and cold, the dark pulling back from the ridge in a gray that wasn't yet light, and then a light that wasn't yet the sun. Cornelius waded out into the lakebed in the cold, the black water at his knees, and his boots full and the cold climbing his legs, the oilcloth notebook pressed inside his coat against his chest where his heart could feel it. He took his stand at the first arch, with the transit set on the shore behind him, and the water stood at the bases of the 4 remaining arches, and the ice had melted, and the surface of the lake was still, and the ridge held the dark a moment longer. The ridge broke. The sun came up at the notch, the exact low point on the southeastern horizon, the bearing had promised, the exact gap the whole row had been aimed at, and the first arch framed it, the light coming through the opening, clean and level across the black water. For a breath, the framed sun stood in the first arch, and then the sun lifted and the light walked down the row, the framed circle, passing from the first arch to the second, and the second to the third, a corridor of light stepping from stone to stone across the water. Each arch caught the sun in its turn and released it to the next, the whole row proving itself in the space of a minute. 9 openings built to receive 1 sunrise in sequence. He stood in the cold water and watched the light walk. The row and the morning opened the door, the way the builders had meant it to, the sun coming through every standing arch in its order, the corridor of light as clean and as deliberate as a sentence read left to right. The proof was complete, and it was silent, and it was over, in the time it took the sun to clear the ridge. The arches that were already under the water didn't catch the light, and the light didn't need them to, because the 4 that remained were enough to show the principle, the stepping of the sun from stone to stone, and the principle was the whole of what the row was for. Cornelius didn't cheer, and he didn't write in the book, because there was nothing to write that the light hadn't already written. He stood in the water and watched the sun lift clear of the last standing arch, and the corridor of light break apart into ordinary morning, the framed circle dissolving into the plain light of a December day, and he felt the 2 things come into him at once and hold still in him the triumph and the cost. He had proven it, and Thaddeus had also been right, because the door was open now, open in the way that matters, open in the knowing of it, and the knowing was in him and would be in the book and wouldn't close when the water closed over the stones, and that was the thing the old trust had been set to prevent. A calendar and a door aimed at the one morning the builders couldn't miss, and the seeing of it was the proof, and the proof was the door that doesn't shut. The sun climbed and the morning became an ordinary morning, and the lake bed was a lake bed. Again the 4 arches standing in the black water with the light full on them and no longer framed, and the row was just a row of stones in a lake. The thing they had been built to do was done for another year, and the water at his knees was already rising toward the lintels. The rain came back that afternoon, heavy and settled, the plateau taking up its soaking where it had left off, and the still water rose to meet it with the slow certainty of a thing returning to its shape. Cornelius stood on the shore with the transit under his arm and watched the near arches go under one by one, the lintels darkening as the water climbed them, the openings filling with black water from the bottom, the stone disappearing by inches the way a thing disappears when you're made to watch it go. The last arch stood alone for a quarter hour with its lintel just above the surface, the single opening holding the gray sky, and then it too sank and the lake bed was a lake again, and the row was gone, and the water lay flat and black over the place where it had been, and the surface gave nothing back, the way the still water always gave nothing back. The notebook in his coat was the only record, the oilcloth damp against his chest and the pages dry inside it, and he had the bearing and the count and the spacing and the morning he had watched the light walk the row, and it was enough to prove it to anyone who read the page. It was also, in Thaddeus's faith, the thing that kept the door open, the pointing written down without the knowing, and Cornelius couldn't say with certainty that Thaddeus was wrong about that, because he had seen the door open and he didn't know what it opened onto, only that it opened, and that's not the same as knowing. He stood on the shore in the rain and held the book against himself and felt the weight of both things, the proof and the not knowing, and neither one would put the other down. The hollow's relief was quiet and total, the relief of people who have watched a wound close and want only to stop looking at it. The water covering the arches was, in their keeping, the closing of the arrangement the drought had broken, and the rain had mended it, and the shore had its old name again, the warning name, and no one in the cove would say it to a stranger or to the surveyor who had stood in it. Orrin brought the ferry back to the waterline, and didn't look at Cornelius when he passed. And Miriam came to the door of the store as he rode up out of the cove and lifted her hand once, not quite a wave and not quite a farewell. The cove went back to the way it had been before the summer, the way it had been for as long as anyone could remember. What was briefly proven slipped back under. The still water lay flat and black in its fold in the cove, and kept the sky in its face and told nothing, and the arches were under it where they had been for the lives of everyone living and the lives before that. The only proof they had ever worked was in an oilcloth notebook in the coat of a man riding down off the plateau. The morning had proven it, and the rain had taken it back, and the mountain had kept it secret the way the mountains keep the things they decide to keep, which is to say quietly and completely, and without any regard for the man who saw it, for a week. The still water lay flat and black over the row, and in a coat pocket in the county seat a notebook said it was all there once. A door aimed at the shortest morning and closed again in the same week. If you want the rest of what the mountains kept quiet, subscribe to the Voice of the Hollow. Older shores are out there, and the water doesn't cover all of them forever.